Well, that's what I'm going to do. All right, let's get this party started. So welcome and thanks for joining me, Geoff. We are going to go on a little journey. I'll give you a moment to introduce yourself in a couple minutes. First, I'll introduce who I am and what we're about to do. So I am Lorraine Smith, and I've had the honor and privilege of working as a sustainability and ESG consultant and advisor for about the last 20 years, mostly working with large companies across different sectors and mostly large international companies, so in different parts of the world. And through that work, I've had the pleasure and adventure of working on something called materiality, or analyzing materiality. And what I'd like to talk about today is an idea I have for a way to really improve and to a certain degree disrupt the notion of materiality and base it in reality. So you'll notice a tweak on the spelling as we go to talk about materiality. To help me out today, I've invited a dear friend, Dr. Geoff Kendall, who I think is really the perfect person to help me with this conversation, both because of his incredible experience and understanding of the subject matter, and also his keen interest in seeing real improvements and disruptions in his own way. So I'm really glad to have you here today. Geoff, do you want to take a couple minutes and just introduce who you are and what you bring to the table?
Yeah, thanks, Lorraine. So yeah, and great to be here. And yeah, my background in this, I mean, we met back in the days when I was consulting at sustainability, and you were too. Me in the New York office and you in New York, me in London, you in New York. And I think I've got a very keen interest in this because, of course, when you're working with companies, what they really want to understand is, well, what do we have to focus on, right? And hence the term, what is most material to us? And it's been a bugbear for me for a long time, because the definition of what companies think is most important to them generally is based on what their own people think or what people outside are shouting loudly about. And that's not, of course, where necessarily the impacts are greatest. So I'm really excited about this discussion. And my work over the last 8 years has partly been exploring this through setting up and running Future Fit Foundation. So we're a non-profit based in the UK, working to define the line in the sand that every business needs to reach to ensure it's in no way undermining a flourishing future for people and other life on the planet. And that is basically about taking system science and boiling it down into practical guidance for companies in terms of goals, metrics, and so forth.
Awesome. You're reminding me why you're the perfect person to be here. And as I take us through a presentation that I've prepared, anybody paying attention will notice that I've been quite influenced by Future Fit, and I've been a very happy sort of participant and cheerleader in what you've done. Do you want to just say a couple of quick words about your experience with materiality assessments in particular, this sort of, let's say, received methodology that's already out there that I'm about to really kick the tires of?
Yeah, I'm quite cynical about traditional approaches to materiality, going back to my days at sustainability. And I don't mean to suggest that sustainability's own approach was wrong. It's just like endemic across the consulting industries that the approach typically goes something like this, right? Take a blank piece of paper. Think of all the important issues that you can possibly come up with that might have some bearing on your business, and then shuffle them around, figure out what you think matters to your business based on what you know already. Maybe ask some of your stakeholders or do some Google searches about which ones other people think are most important to them. And then you plot a matrix with, on one axis, you've got importance to our business. And on the other axis, you've got importance to our stakeholders. And then you'll plot these different issues. And you might use the size of the bubble that you plot to represent the difficulty or the urgency or some other factor around that. And then what you'll do is you'll get your nice shiny new matrix, which you've kind of come up with through some kind of process that, you know, tries to be systematic, but really there's a lot of opinion involved. And then you'll put it in front of your CEO. And then your CEO will splutter and react violently and say, I don't want that bubble up there. And so some things will be moved around. And then you'll finalize it And that will be what goes into your sustainability report. That will be supposedly what drives your business decisions and so forth. But more often, it just drives what you end up reporting on. And I think for me, that might sound quite cynical, but I've seen no end of situations where two analysts might be working on the same assessment for the same company or similar companies, and they'll come up with something vastly different. So there's very little method in the madness, in my view.
Yeah, well, so in some ways, you've just given a great synopsis of what I'm about to demonstrate and what I think we could potentially do differently. So, of course, we're sort of each other's witness leading one another since we've had a chance to work side by side. But you're really articulating for me why there's a great opportunity to do better and do differently. I'm going to share my screen here and walk us through some ideas, some of which will really echo what you just said. And then I'll sort of build out, so what do I think we can do about it? And I am going to set this up in such a way that I'll describe what's on the slides. I'll explain why this is the way it is and what I think. Geoff, I welcome you to sort of chime in, question, query, build as we go. I'm developing this in real time. These are my ideas that I'm offering, and I can explain a bit more of the context there if we've got time at the end. Well, actually, I'll give a little bit of context on that right now, and then we can put a bow on it later. In that, over the last 20 years or so, my focus has been on sustainability, and a lot of that has landed in the ESG, environmental social governance, reporting, strategy, engagement camp. And very much as Geoff just described, I see a lot of the same concerns. I see a lot of amazing work being done, a lot of incredible homework and relationships being built, and a lot of strategic thinking. And then I see some sort of endemic challenges in the methodologies, exactly as you just said, Geoff. So I've been thinking for really focusing the last probably 6 or 7 years in this work, where materiality has really become a received thing. More and more companies are sort of demanding these analyses from consultants like us. We're seeing a mainstreaming of the ESG conversation, and that's pushed even greater demand into the analyzing and the reporting. And in some ways that's been very exciting, but for me, it's also really highlighted the sort of broken parts or the not yet fully hatched parts that could really use some pretty serious redesign before we go too much further. And I've conducted dozens of materiality assessments. I've either been in-house in the team that's been conducting them with an agency, or as an independent consultant brought in to just bring one piece of the puzzle. I've also been a stakeholder who's been engaged. So I've been interviewed by other consultants doing the assessing. So I've seen materiality from a number of angles, from the inside and outside. And I think my colleagues and teammates would probably echo this. I don't know how positive it would sound as they'd say, that I've been sort of trying to bend it and twist it into a different shape for some time from within the existing process. And at a certain point, I realized that doesn't work. I need to step all the way out and just independently, in no commercial context whatsoever, just do some thinking and reimagine what I would do if I had nothing in the way and could just proceed. And so that's where this presentation and idea that I'm about to share comes from, in the spirit of thinking out loud and sharing what I can based on my experience and my understanding. And so I'll take us through this deck. And I just want to clarify that I will be giving voiceover, and Geoff and we can have a discussion. And I will make this deck available. They are Google Slides, so anybody can see them. And both the audio and video of this conversation will be made available as well on my website. So depending on how you're receiving this information right now, you can just be aware that those additional layers are available, and that's how I'm structuring this conversation. So with that, I just want to quickly regroup on what is the purpose of this document, which is the Google Slides that I will make available. And it is simply to introduce materiality, and you'll notice the tweak on the spelling. It is using an E instead of an I to base materiality in reality. And this is a response to the current approach to assessing materiality, which is a very common process in the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG reporting space, as well as the overall strategy. I just want to make it super clear at this point, I'm assuming if you've made it this far, you have a basic understanding of ESG reporting and materiality, that you've had some experience, you're in the field, or you're at least on the edges of it. If that's not true, you'll want to pause and step out and go find out more about what this is about, because this is going to be pretty inside baseball here. What I'm going to do is touch on the process, the inputs, and the approach of both materiality, as it's often done, really putting some nuts and bolts to what Geoff just mentioned in his introduction, and compare that to what I believe is required for materiality, or that sort of reality-based approach. There's going to be a few links in the last slide that offer some trails. I don't give a lot of links, just really a snapshot of some of the key organizations that are referenced here, including, of course, FutureFit, of which Geoff is one of the founders. Super important to recognize what this isn't. This is not a comprehensive view on what is wrong with ESG reporting today. There's a lot of dialogue about that, a lot of really interesting voices chiming in. I've certainly made some of my concerns public on my blog and on my Medium page. That's not where we're going today. It's connected, and issues may come up, but that's not what we're going to do. And it is also not a complete view of how I believe the industry and economy of the future should be. That's a pretty complex, interconnected story. We'll certainly touch on some possibilities there, but I am not going to really go too deep there today. I'll give a rough sketch of what I'm basing this in, but can't go too far there today. And last but not least, this is also not the only way to adapt the current approach of materiality. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that could vary. And I've got a few other ideas. I'm going to focus on my main one around nesting it in reality. But you may have other ideas and questions and possibilities as well. And so that's a kind of exciting space to be in, that there's lots of room to improve. Wherever we go, I really hope this offers you some guidance, some provocation, maybe some insights, ways to see things that you haven't before, and some resources. So to begin, I just want to set the stage around the key difference that I'm proposing, or differences, because there's some very specific differences. Some are a bit nuanced. So I want to explain the sort of arc of materiality as it is now, typically, and what I believe needs to be different. With materiality as it's typically done today, there is, at the end of the analysis, there is a list of company-specific siloed issues that are agreed by an internal team within the company. They may have hired an external consultant, but ultimately it's the company on the inside that agrees. And sometimes it's quite an extensive list. Many of those material issues are indeed quite relevant. In fact, they're probably all relevant to the company, and sometimes the degree to which they're interrelated is discussed in some way. But there's really no meaningful guidance for the company's decision makers. In fact, the purpose of the assessment isn't really to offer guidance. We would, in fact, I can think of 1,000 times that I would be in a engagement and saying, this is really to serve as a discussion tool. And so lots of discussion. And then the other thing that comes from it, so there's typically a made public at a glance matrix or list, or maybe it takes a different format, but it's often a matrix. And then there's also a much deeper analysis that is confidential. So most external stakeholders don't see that would go deeper on the material issues, where they landed, maybe some quotes from stakeholders, additional links and resources as proof points. In other words, the company has bought a lengthy and rather expensive, sometimes PowerPoint about global issues. That is the deliverable, if you will. And usually those results just go into the ESG report. That's sort of the thing that happens. Sometimes that might also influence a company goal setting process if they're reviewing their ESG strategy. It probably will influence a few stakeholder relationships. These aren't bad things, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with adding useful information to your report and improving relationships. But rarely, if ever, and I'm going to say in my personal experience, never on an official sort of deliverable level has a materiality analysis stated how the company's business model is dependent on the perpetuation of some of these issues. I mean, many of these issues are very endemic to the current economic model. So it's a little bit awkward. So that's how materiality happens today. And again, that's quite reflective, Geoff, of what you said off the top. I should say different consultants have different approaches and there are tweaks to this methodology, but I've seen it done by a number of different, like the big four, the PwCs, et cetera, and by smaller independent or more sustainability focused shops. And I'm sort of aggregating the net of what I see. What I propose needs to be different in materiality, or basing this type of analysis in reality, is that in fact, there is just one short set of issues for all companies. And that short set of issues respects the fact that we are in an interspecies, interconnected world. And that is just a basic requirement for human society to thrive. It's not optional, even if you think it's a bit odd. And the focus of the analysis really needs to get at the needed characteristics for a company to contribute to a flourishing future. So the focus really needs to be on, like, what is that future that we want to be in? And what are the characteristics of a company for that to be true? So it really helps set the direction of travel for the company to participate, to contribute to not undermine a flourishing future. It's very different than the emphasis of materiality today, which is like, okay, what are the things that are happening versus what do we want the world to be like? And in terms of the executive engagement, so Geoff, you rightly noted that often, and I skipped over this in a couple of minutes ago, but often in a conventional materiality analysis, there will be an executive presentation of some sort. And the idea is to say, this is where we've landed in our analysis. Maybe the executives help finalize or validate in some way, but generally speaking, it's just a received PowerPoint. What I've seen is that if executives need internal buy-in to understand that this is an interspecies, interconnected world, and we need to understand the desired future in order to set the direction of travel. If that is a leap for the executive team, then there's no external assessment that's going to fix that. There's no list of issues that says, here's some things we noticed or stakeholders said. That is a bigger challenge that an external consultant and all kinds of smart thinking and beautiful slides cannot address. However, if they do already understand this, then really the analysis needs to illustrate areas for business model redesign. And that might come up with some of the similar issues that a conventional analysis would touch on, but without really looking at the business's design and in fact the industry's design to contribute to and not undermine the future we want. Those issues are just going to keep coming up over and over. And so I want to make something really explicit here, because this is also a pretty significant departure from the assessments as they're done now. This approach intentionally avoids assuming certain institutional constructs of today. So certain ways of educating, for example, or certain currency models, or certain operational institutions. It says those things are potentially interesting and relevant for the future, but the point is not those structures, it's designing for the future we want. This is intentional to avoid prescribing solutions from the worldview that created the problems. And that is really fundamental to materiality. So I'm going to take us forward and touch a bit more on some of the nuts and bolts of the process. But just before I do, Geoff, I've just kind of given a high level what's different here. Any reflections you want to offer before I go forward?
Only that just to paraphrase to make sure I've understood, it sounds like you're saying that this is about understanding the future we want and how far away the organization is from positively contributing to that future, and offering signposts as to how it might close that gap. Exactly. Versus assuming that the current business model will continue indefinitely and just saying, how do we reduce the harm that that model's causing?
Bingo. I would say that's exactly it. And again, no coincidence, my cheerleading and awareness of future fit, because that's very much the material that you have fostered bringing into the world. And I would strongly encourage people who aren't familiar with future fit to go take a look. But this is very much based in a similar principle. And I'd also note, for those who aren't familiar with future fit, that that notion of backcasting, of understanding where we want to get to and then working our way towards that from the current, from the present, is built into this as well. So that's the notion. Where do we want to be? how different are we from that, and how do we close that gap? Definitely, that's a helpful reframing or paraphrasing. Okay, I'm going to jump into some very specific details about the process here. I've alluded to them at a high level, Geoff mentioned as well, but I want to just emphasize, so where would this be different? If you've got your list of sort of actions, and the consultants who, all 6 of you who might listen to this, along with my mother, who have been in these assessments before, I'm sure you can picture that slide. I didn't cut and paste from one of the dozens of proposals and deliverables that I've been involved in. I thought that'd be dodgy. And this is entirely just sort of from my own mind, completely unbranded slides so that I can keep it pretty neutral, but you'll recognize the steps that are here. Basically, a typical materiality assessment today involves an internal and external document review. And just to be clear, that is usually looking at a wide array of documents, many of which are provided by the company. We're usually under a non-disclosure agreement, meaning that what we're reviewing from them, we are to keep confidential. And sometimes we would have access to stuff that I could see why they would want to keep it confidential. Although I'm going to say rarely do I ever feel like I'm mucking around in something where I'm like, whoa, major corporate secrets. Like, no, but it's a lot of details around things like HR policies, maybe their approach to innovation, product innovation, maybe some of the toxics reductions work they've done, maybe past analyses, stakeholder interviews, et cetera. Then we're also looking externally, and we're looking at, what are some of the industry associations discussing in terms of issues at the industry level. What would some of the wider sort of sustainability oriented organizations be talking about in terms of key issues? Where is there some NGO activity, investor activism, et cetera? So we're really sort of scanning the landscape of available documents and wrapping our arms around what's going on out there. We would also generally conduct stakeholder interviews. That would be internal, usually a cross-functional group, and external. I've seen everything from 12 to 120 interviews for materiality assessments, including internal and external. So that can sometimes be quite extensive, and that's often why materiality assessments can be quite expensive, because those conversations take a long time. They're often very valuable, very interesting. They're usually pretty templated. And there's also sometimes a survey that goes at the same time where the similar questions are going out. I want to clarify what those questions usually get at. They're essentially saying, usually something like, tell us about your relationship with this company so we can understand where you're coming from. And then what do you think the most important ESG issues are? That's basically the question. It's sometimes templated a bit more. What do you think the most important environmental issues are? Social issues, governance issues, or maybe the interview goes something like, I'm going to read a list of issues and ask you to rank them from most important to least important, or something like that. So depending on the process, the consultant, the company, et cetera, it may be more or less templated, but the object of the game is to get the stakeholder to say what they think the most important ESG issues are. Maybe we'll look at opportunities and other things as well, but that's the nuts and bolts. Further, these interviews are only conducted with humans. I'll get to that in a second. So coming from that, the output is a long list of issues, ESG issues. And then from there, we would organize them and prioritize them by how much impact or importance they might have for the stakeholders versus the company. And if you're seeing the video, you're seeing I'm making my arms into a kind of 2x2 matrix, and that is often what's used to plot the issues in relation to one another. Sometimes there's real math behind that, where actual numbers are assigned based on number of mentions, based on degree of importance assigned in the survey, et cetera. And sometimes it's a little bit more of a finger in the wind. I'm going to say, even when there are numbers there, it's still largely a finger in the wind, but that's a subjective comment on my part. The output is usually a write-up about the issues in some detail that is confidential. And then the high-level list or matrix, et cetera, is public. There's that kind of, maybe there's an executive presentation of some sort, but the real output that is visible to the rest of the world is in the ESG report. That is, for the most part, in my experience, the primary purpose of conducting an materiality assessment is to improve, increase, enhance ESG reporting. What I believe is needed to reflect reality in assessing materiality is that whatever is understood can be accessed publicly. So I would be grounding this in publicly available documentation. That's going to be ESG disclosures. and lots of other publicly available material. I would, and by the way, I'm inventing this. So this is a process that I think could work, especially because in the moment, the context is there's no commercial relationship. Nobody's asking me to do this. I'm just taking it upon myself to do it. And so I would be not having internal conversations, but rather only reaching to external stakeholders. But there's all kinds of possibilities here. An important note here, though, is not just external human stakeholders, but non-human stakeholders. And there's a lot I could say about this. This is like a whole other universe of thought and feeling and awareness. But I would just say it's really important for us to understand that there is perspective far beyond our own. And one of the things that's gotten us into this pickle is our structural belief, whether we individually hold it or not, that humans are at the top of the pyramid, the center of the wheel, or whatever metaphor you might like. And so we have not listened to the non-human elements of our healthy societies. And we need to change that. I have some ideas about how to do that, and I'm going to set that aside for here. But let's just say it is more than doable, and there's ways we can really effectively listen to those, let's say, non-human stakeholders. I would also say a very key distinction here is that while traditional materiality seeks to identify a list of issues and then prioritize them based on importance to stakeholders and the company, this way of looking at it seeks to analyze a company's current and potential future contribution to ecosystems and society, and to prioritize business model impacts based on a desired future. So back to your query there, Geoff, the nut of this is really to get at, so how is, or how could a company contribute? How are they contributing? How could they be contributing? Or are they undermining? Or would they be undermining into the future? To this future that we believe is the one we want. And based on that, how can we prioritize changes to the business model itself, to the way in which the company makes money? That is fundamentally different than organizing a list of issues. The output would be a write-up, again, but all public, as well as the detailed results. So making the conversations public as well, and any other inputs that go into it. And I believe the primary purpose of this exercise, my purpose for undertaking this, is to contextualize existing public information. There's no shortage of public information out there, to reflect reality, not to bend it into what could support continued activity within the context of the current business, but to reflect reality, to inform structural change. So those are some nuts and bolts and details on the process. I'm just going to say a little bit more about the process and then see what's sparking for you, Geoff, about some of these new ideas coming up. So in old materiality that I think has set the stage, but it's ready to evolve, there are dozens of issues and sub-issues, and they are sorted out of context, almost by definition, by taking these topics, climate change, human rights, etc., and deciding, how to divide and organize them, slice and dice so that they are organized in a way the company can digest. It is really entirely in relation to the company. And of course, some effort goes into understanding these issues, and that's great. Like, it's good to understand them, but rarely is the design of the company's business model up for discussion. So I'm kind of beating that drum. I would note that there has been some great emergence around the topic of context and thresholds. So this is not a new idea I'm putting forward. Folks like Bill Bowie and Ralph Thurm at R 3.0, they can tell you that there's lots of great things that can be done on this, and they've published a fair bit. I include that in the resources at the end. As far as I've seen at the moment, that's often essentially a patch. So, oh yeah, what about context? Like, we should do something about that, versus that's where this is rooted. And so what I propose is we need to put the company in the context of the future we want, so the real issues can be understood. And there are only a few material issues that need attention. These issues can be articulated and organized in a number of ways. There's no one way to frame like the ultimate reality. I certainly don't have a lock on that. But I think we can be honest and say a business either contributes to the improvement of these issues or to their worsening. And more to the point, the business model is either designed to improve or to worsen the impacts on these issues. And this matters if the business is serious about a flourishing future. I will say, I know that there's a lot of nuance here. It's quite possible that a business is both contributing and undermining. And so we can talk a bit more about that in a sec. Before I press on, Geoff, is this sparking any questions or reflections that based on what you know so far?
Yeah, a couple of reflections. First one, it brings to mind Henry Ford's famous quote that when asked, like, how much do you listen to your customers? And he said, I don't listen to my customers at all about what they want, because if I asked them, they would ask for a faster horse.
Right.
And I think what we're talking about here is the difference between focusing on what really matters to society and ecosystems, rather than what certain people at certain moments in time think is most important to them. And one example I would give is, no one you ever ask cares about the impacts of water scarcity on them until their own taps run dry, right? That might be an incredibly important issue a few days or months or even years before that tap runs dry, but they just don't know about it. So this, for me, it's bringing that, well, reality into it. So that's great. And the other thing, I think you're right about this focus on only a few material issues. Sometimes you see a materiality matrix that has, bubbles of equal stature for climate and employee satisfaction.
Yeah.
And you think, how can you make sense of which matters most when you've got these very differently scaled issues to work on? So yeah, all makes sense to me.
Cool. Yeah, and you'll see I've advanced the slide here to kind of underscore your point, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So Geoff, what you're alluding to is that we often end up analyzing a set of issues that are sort of a jumble. And so what I've set up on the screen here is twofold. The first fold is just to highlight where we would often look to identify issues. So I mentioned that process, we look at documents, we talk to stakeholders. So just going a little bit deeper there are actual sources of material issues. So we could look at things like the Global Reporting Initiative and its indicators and guidance. And there's, that's a good kind of broad source of all of the possible topics. But SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, took it upon itself a couple of years ago to create a pretty comprehensive set of material issues, and then to help industry by industry to home in on, okay, well, which are the bigger priorities for certain parts of the industries and which are less of a priority. And there are many more: Sustainable Development Goals, World Economic Forum puts out a risk report, et cetera, et cetera. So we can tally up many issues. But what ends up happening, and what, if you're looking at the visual here, you'll see that I've created a kind of mocked up 2x2 matrix that sort of mirrors the typical matrix in a materiality report. And I've used a word cloud to do it. And every word or set of words in this matrix, these are actual material issues from actual materiality analyses. And so mixed in here, just so you know, are the 26 issues that SASB says this is kind of the set of issues, and then it kind of slices and dices them by sector. And then I did a quick scan. I mean, I think I looked at 4 materiality reports, one in mining, one in pharma, one in finance, and there was another one in there that'll come to me. And I just looked at their materiality assessments, at their matrices, and cherry picked. I didn't even put in them all. I literally could offer 4 times the number. And I was like, this word cloud is getting really hard to read. These are all material issues. Everything from, the other company, sorry, was a major food company. So everything from, obesity and product quality and safety to the circular economy. The circular economy is a material issue for some companies. Local communities are material issues for some companies. Chemicals of concern. So how do you even begin to create a hierarchy and something sensible here? So what I propose is more to the point, to get us to where we want to be in reality, is this much shorter understanding of the future we want that is really quite simply looking at what does it mean to have thriving biodiverse ecosystems. And I offer a little bit more framing around that, which would be that they are respected and understood as essential to human thriving. So that gets at the mindset or the worldview. And they're free from pollution and overexploitation. Simply, we have ecosystems that are healthy. And conceptually, I offer a visual. That's the sort of great big circular Mother Earth that holds us all. Within that is society. And I see that second piece, society, as thriving, diverse human societies that have universal access to nutritious food, safe, comfortable shelter, clean energy, clean water, learning and development opportunities, and the means to lead meaningful, purposeful lives. Now, I want to just clarify here, I haven't just made these ideas up. I've sort of drawn on a lot of things. Certainly Future Fit has helped organize and sort of strategize in my own mind. And there are many articulations of the future we want. And I'm going to say just a tiny bit more about that. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts again, Geoff. I want to emphasize a couple things, though. I don't think it's actually all that important how we organize this. I really don't. I mean, I welcome additions, subtractions, critique, as long as the fundamental element of healthy biological ecosystems is available for healthy, thriving societies, then how you describe what is needed for that and the level of detail, I think, is secondary. But what's been missing from so many articulations of this, and it gets completely overlooked in most materiality assessments, is that these are not options. You cannot have a thriving society in a failing biosphere. And societies cannot thrive without these basics. So I also just want to circle back to something I mentioned off the top. One of the key sort of nuanced differences here is I don't believe that materiality based in reality should prescribe a way forward. I think it can indicate the direction of travel. It's very important not to prescribe the structures from within the system that has created the difficulties. So I've done my best to be as sort of solution neutral as possible, describing, for example, learning and development opportunities, because it's my understanding that's really important to human thriving, but that isn't necessarily education or school. It might be, but it might not be. And that isn't for me to decide in terms of what must be in the future. More, it's for me to believe for us to thrive, there are things we need and we ought to enable them to be true and not undermine them. So that's really the logic around this suite. I'm going to say one more quick thing, Geoff, and then I really want to hear what you have to say. It's kind of inevitable in these conversations in which I have participated many times, and I know you have too, Geoff. What about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? Because in many ways, they have been designed to kind of solve for this, right? Like, what is the whole universe of stuff that the world needs to do in order to have the future we want? And of course, that's a phrase that's in the SDG documents themselves. Well, so couldn't the Sustainable Development Goals be used as a kind of proxy for materiality? And I'm just going to come out and say no. And here's why. There's two very specific and clear reasons that I've seen play out over and over as why they break when we try to make this happen. The first is that they're quite simply very human-centric. I understand why they're human-centric, but that means that they fall down as a comprehensive materiality tool. They are oriented towards ensuring humans thrive without genuinely placing us within the wider web of life. And they nest in that sort of, this is about us and how we make us better. Of course, there are many ecosystem-oriented goals and targets and indicators, but it's still about getting humans to get what we need. And don't get me wrong, I don't think humans shouldn't get what we need, but I don't think that serves as a proxy for materiality for a company. The second reason is very related to that human-centric issue. They are very much based in a kind of global north economic development mindset. And that is the very mindset that created the problems we're trying to solve. So to use this very sort of interconnected, seemingly comprehensive set of goals that were designed within the model that caused the problem will quite bluntly not solve the problem. And there's a lot I'd love to say there, but I'll keep this part super brief. I'll just say that they missed the mark in terms of being framed within a context that is not dependent on the current model. It's really propagating the current model. I'll just pause there and Geoff, see if this prompts any questions or things you want to dig into deeper as materiality comes to fruition.
I think your high level framing of what we need to aim for is great. And like you say, it's not prescriptive, it's more principle based. The SDGs, I agree with you. I think the SDGs are great insofar as so many countries got behind them that they gave us a kind of shared understanding that we need to deal with some pretty big problems, to the point that, you know, back in the day before the SDGs came out, we used to spend a lot of our time in the sustainability profession trying to convince CEOs that they should even pay attention to this stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas post SDGs, it switched to be more about, okay, that's taken as read. Now what do we do about this stuff? So they've been helpful there, but I agree with you that as a framing for actually guiding action, they're not very helpful. Some of them are desired outcomes like no poverty. Some of them are more like, here's what we will try to do, like responsible production and consumption. So they don't really work that well. One question though I have is, could you say a bit more about what you mean about the global north aspect of this? It sounds like you're saying global north / economic development mindset, as if economic development is only a global north thing, but maybe I've misunderstood that.
Yeah, no, you probably didn't misunderstand. And this is another one I'd love to unpick a lot further. And in a few other channels, I have the privilege of listening and learning a lot more about the notion of sort of decolonizing the future and really understanding what we might call a global south perspective. I'll say a little bit about this, and then I'd love for this to be something that we unpick further around, like how to make this really live and be effective in this context. So I'm glad you lifted it up. But simply put, there is I'd say either an understanding or perhaps a blindness, I'll say with some respect and humility, that the way we've conducted business so far is good. It's just got some problems attached to it that we need to adjust. And we've largely overlooked that it's been predominantly based on an extractive, sometimes very colonial, even sort of slavery-based model. And that isn't random. It isn't like one day companies just decided that it was okay to dig holes in the earth and poison rivers and underpay people or treat them under slave conditions. This has come from, you know, depending on when you start the clock and how you look at economic history, let's just say for simplicity in this conversation, 400 years of the development of the multinational corporation and capitalism as we know it today. And so north isn't exactly a line on the map. It isn't like everything north of, you know, the equator, but it is the kind of dominant, hegemonic, European, North American corporate mindset. And there's lots going on in Europe and North America and other parts of what we might call the global north that is very innovative, very decolonized, and really looking at this in ways far more sophisticated than I am here. And there's lots in the global south that you could say, or as in south of, you know, south on the map, that is following in the footsteps of this economic extractive, you know, endless growth model. So it's a little bit blurry. But I would say the SDGs are, although many countries participated, you know, it's UN-led, the UN has some politics and funding, and it is really focused on what we would call conventional economic development. So I don't know, does that answer the question? It's a pretty big topic, so I don't want to give it too short shrift, but.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's the difference between a perspective that is often dominant in Europe and the US. And let's face it, all those institutions that talk about what material issues are, none of which are based in Mombasa or Joburg or whatever.
That's right.
So it's the difference between that thinking, no, capitalism has been universally good, but it has some problems we need to tweak, versus, no, the entire human enterprise has been one that's exploitative and extractive over a period of several centuries. And from down here, it doesn't look like it's worked at all.
Right. Yeah. And that is a huge topic. I'm going to push us forward just in the spirit of covering this, but I love that you've raised it, and I'm putting a little pin in that to revisit. So briefly, the approach with old school materiality, as we've talked about to a degree, issues are not in context, and there is an embedded assumption that we cannot touch the current economic norms. So that sort of human enterprise that you just described, Geoff, well, of course, we know there are beautiful variations. This is not an absolute, but it is relatively conventional within the mainstream market context and the mainstream financial market context, that there's an assumption that the current economic model is the way, and so we're going to kind of fix the most broken bits, and that's how materiality is structured. The typical matrix looking to plot based on importance to stakeholders versus impact on the business. Final report gets published. The rest is a black box that most people have zero access to. What I propose with this reality-based approach to materiality is something quite different. I'm certainly open to keeping a 2x2 matrix in the mix, and that, I guess, deep down, like, I'm a mainstream settler from Canada who has been trained to think in a linear mechanistic way, so it's hard for me to totally shake that first language. But I also do still see the value of simplified outputs. So I do see the opportunity for a 2x2 matrix here, but what it would be comparing is against two dimensions. So one dimension being impact on ecosystem health, and the other dimension being impact on societal health. So really focusing the dimensions on the desired future. And rather than trying to plot issues, I propose that materiality needs to plot the company in terms of where it currently is in relation to contributing to or undermining the future we want. And I can see different ways. So this is a place where I'm still sort of testing, and I'm actually in the process of doing a prototype to see, like, well, how would this actually look if we did it? And I can share a little bit more on that. But I'm planning on assessing Google to begin with. Feels like, why not? Because I'm using Google Slides and using Google for a whole bunch of things. So why not actually assess the company that is part of my day-to-day life? And the idea, though, would be to really give stakeholders the opportunity to say how they see this company contributing. And there are many ways to express the ideal, the future we want, a regenerative economy, flourishing future, a donut economy, etc. So what are the best ways to express it? I'm tossing some ideas around here. With the SDGs, we sort of touch on the decolonized, socially just human culture, thriving within planetary boundaries. But that's just English, right? That's just one language. So what does it look like when we really start to pick this apart? Most importantly, though, I just want to emphasize that the idea here is to compare companies in terms of their performance towards the desired future state, and that is the goal, not increased GDP, not contributing to economic development. These are not effective goals. They might have some useful parts to them, but they are not the goal. The goal is to contribute to the future we want. If the future business model cannot participate in that, then it needs to change, right? Like, that's reality. It may be a very uncomfortable reality, but it is also reality. And if we're not talking about that, then we're not really talking about reality in terms of the future we want. And so I propose that I am in the process of conducting interviews with stakeholders who have a perspective on a given company. Talking about Google is a very interesting enterprise, and letting stakeholders describe how they understand the desired future. What are its characteristics? I have some words I've been using. I'm going to make these words public, but other people have other ways of describing it. And other non-humans might express something that I can pick up on. And then understanding, how is the company contributing to this future? And I'm going to bet, especially a company like Google, there are ways that it is, and there are ways that it isn't. So it's undermining. And it would also be interesting to look at, what is the opportunity to contribute? Like, what would need to change in order to contribute? And that gets a bit woolier, because there's lots of things, like, I'm not even cognitively capable of imagining at this point, but exploring and really provoking and prompting. The net effect of the output needs to illustrate a company's contribution to the desired future based on reality. And if it is a net negative contribution, as this matrix proposes, so it's a 2x2 matrix, And I believe that there's room for negative on this. So everything above the horizontal line is net positive contribution to impact on ecosystem health. Below would be net negative or undermining. And everything to the right of the vertical line is a net contribution to societal health. And everything to the left would be a net undermining of societal health. I would imagine it's a mix. And so, how do you reflect that mix? I think there's different ways to do it. And what I'm proposing to do is offer these as public outputs. So put the analysis, the things I've found, the documents, the information, the evidence, the sort of interlinked materials in a way that anybody can look at, all based on public information, so nothing confidential whatsoever. Providing a summary, just a kind of quick snapshot, like what is this telling us about the contribution or undermining to the future we want in terms of the business model, in terms of these sort of reality or materiality findings, and links to all of those public sources so anybody can take a look. And then with the matrix, what I was thinking of doing was making it so that each of the bubbles is representative of a stakeholder conversation. So it's kind of an aggregate where the stakeholder would put the company in that conversation. And then with links to those stakeholder interviews, both as audio transcripts, if people want to listen, and obviously it would be explicit that we are sharing this, and also the videos. And I've actually been asking the St. Lawrence River, who I live right beside, how best to do that for the river in a way that is respectful and also useful and practical. So that's kind of a snapshot of what I'm thinking of doing, what I am doing, and a thing of sharing with the world. So I'll pause there and see, Geoff, what comes up for you? Questions, reflections, anything else?
Yeah, initial reaction is I love it. I think it's great. I could see all sorts of ways you could build out from this as well. So for example, those stakeholder bubbles, getting each stakeholder group to say, well, where do you think the organization could go, and how do you think it could get there? Mm-hmm. Might come up with all sorts of ideas the company hasn't ever thought of around how to actually address some of these things. So that's great. I guess two thoughts. One is, how do you hope people are going to use this? And the other is, what you've said has, as with many good ideas, it's so blindingly obvious, it makes you wonder why no one's done it before. So why now? What triggered you to do this now? That's it really.
Maybe I'll start with the second one first, because it might lead me to answer the other one, also because I'm not too sure about the first one. But what triggered me to do this now is I feel extremely fortunate to have participated in so many materiality assessments, in that, I've been sort of paid to go to school in a way, right? I've been paid to work with some incredible companies and teams within companies and external stakeholders in different countries and different industries and different languages. And with that, I've continued to notice this challenge. As you say, it's kind of blindingly obvious, but I haven't been paid to express that. And it's been a bit of a kind of internal disconnect. And teams whom I've worked with will say, like, you've tried, you've brought this up in different ways, in different contexts and different times, but it just hasn't felt doable within the confines of the existing construct. And so I realized, I give guidance to people. I say, Geoff, you and I have had some pretty sparky conversations about what to do in various contexts and how to, make change in our own lives. And I often say, sometimes it's going to be messy and we're not going to know what comes next. And we'll have this idea, but we won't be able to see the steps, and we just got to go for it. And I realized I needed to take my own advice there and just say, I don't know how this is going to work, but I'm going to step all the way out of the traditional materiality process that I've been paid and kept my lights on to do, and just have a listen and have a sense and go for it and see what happens. And so the trigger has really been just an awareness that I feel, I'll be immodest for a moment and say, I'll feel uniquely positioned to be able to do this, and that I have had the access and the skill development And I have some flexibility. I don't have a family. I don't have too many crushing responsibilities. And I feel like the time is now. So that was sort of the trigger. I'll be really transparent and say I do not have any funding for this. This is entirely me going, I think this is worth doing. I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing it, and then I'll have to find a way to pay my bills, which will be interesting. But companies are also going to be looking at their business models, which is how they've been paying their bills, and they're going to need to disrupt themselves. And so I guess I'm also like in a fractal way trying to say, like, I'm pretty sure it's worth doing. And so I'm going to practice the thing that I wish would happen on a larger scale, and just trust that there's some way that it can be contributing to the future I want. And so to your first question, how do I hope people will use this? Gosh, I mean, a simple way would be, I hope that consultants that are still involved in current materiality assessments will take a look at this and find at least a piece or two that they can say, let's just wedge this in here, just like spark at least something that shifts things, some requirement to discuss the business model, for example, or some opportunity to say, but we also think the future needs to be discussed, or something from a process perspective. And then maybe, I don't know, I guess my dream would be that someone somewhere uses this and realizes that there's a whole other way to think about designing business and designing industry to be a healing force. I talk about industrial healing. And what I mean by that is not like so much healing that it's an industrial scale. I mean, industries heal. And right now that's absurd to consider. And yet I believe it's not only like a nice idea, it's absolutely necessary and entirely possible. It's how nature typically works. And when we bring that worldview back into our view, we can see that industry absolutely could be a force for healing, and already is in some contexts. And so how could somebody use this to just inform that in some way? And it's probably, again, beyond my imagination or cognitive power. So I'm just going to go for it and put a few assessments out there and see what happens. It's kind of at least what I'm thinking for now.
Well, I think that's great. And it certainly is more of an enabler for redesign and reimagining than just for reporting. And that's really what we need right now. So it might sound weird, but I'm glad you don't have a family and all those other burdens that would prevent you from doing this, because I think there are a lot of people in the space who, if and when they look at this, will think, God, yeah, I wish I'd done that, or I have ideas that are kind of like that, maybe not as full formed, but this is what's needed. So hopefully some of those people can pick up on this and shamelessly copy your ideas. I mean, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? As my brother is fond of saying, people don't have ideas. When their time is right, ideas have people, and often multiple people at the same time. And I think this is one of those things, right? We're all trying to move beyond just talking about incremental improvement to a broken system, and start to reimagine what would a flourishing system look like. And this, feels like a great tool in that. I can't wait to see your analysis of Google.
Yeah, me either. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Geoff. I really appreciate you letting me walk you through this. It's really helpful for me as I'm sort of forming the ideas. I mentioned that there's a few resources at the back of this deck. This will be public on my site. So if you've heard this, by the time you're hearing this, it's public. I'm going to stop sharing here and just kind of bring us back. And just say that the next steps that happen from here are that I make this video and the audio of it and these slides available in a way that's really easy to find on my website, blorrainesmith.com. I invite feedback, questions, dialogue. I know there are a lot of people, as you said, Geoff, a lot of this idea is having a lot of people. So certainly there is really active dialogue on how to improve ESG reporting, analysis, engagement, and materiality is kind of like the muscle in ESG. So how do we strengthen that muscle, and how do we make it smarter, more agile, and fit for the long haul? So any ideas around how to do that? And quite honestly, if there's anything here that anybody wants to just take and run with, please do. Like, that's why I'm doing it and putting it out there. I'm not doing it to make myself busier or famous. I'd like to live in that world that we talk about. So that's my intention here. I thank you, Geoff, very much for your insights and your time and your inspiration. Definitely you went and got birthed by an idea at Future Fit, and that's been such a great gift to the Creative Commons, to the world, and to many businesses and friends and fans. So I'm really grateful that you've been able to join me today, and for your friendship and your encouragement. So thank you. And any parting words you want to offer any listeners or viewers who've made it this far?
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine. It's privileged to be in at the ground level of this. And if it really does change the world, then I can say I was there on day one. So that's nice.
Well, the world's already a tiny bit different, I guess, in some small way. Awesome. Well, thanks. And I'll just offer a call to action to anybody paying attention here to apply the lens of reality-based materiality in whatever it is you're doing. And a good friend of mine reminds me of the phrase that courage is contagious. And it does take a bit of courage to say some of these things in different contexts, because either they just haven't been said before, you might be seen as a little bit heretical. But actually, there's a lot of like inner relaxation that happens when you realize, like, oh, some of this stuff just makes more sense, and to move towards that warmth or that good sense. So thank you again for listening, and appreciate any feedback, questions, comments, or just shameless propagation. Thanks, folks. Bye for now.